If there was any doubt in your mind as to the divine authorship of the Bible, Daniel 11 will dispel all of your doubts if you're honest. Daniel 11 is the most detailed, specific, and extensive prophecy in the Bible, at least singular prophecy given in the Bible, and this is part 2 of our in-depth KJV Bible-believing study of Daniel 11, and it starts now. All right, we'll be live streaming to YouTube and also to Sermon Audio. You can find these lessons on Sermon Audio. If you just type in Matt Crane, you find these and 100 other Bible studies, in-depth Bible studies on there. If you enjoy this content, share these lessons with your friends and family. Subscribe to the YouTube channel below. And if you're interested in additional in-depth studies, I have 4 books that I've written that are available through Final Fight Bible Radio. And I also broadcast these lessons on Final Fight Bible Radio at 8 o'clock a.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. Pacific Time. And if you're interested in supporting Final Fight Bible Radio or myself, you can do so through the FFBR app, the FFBR website, the Sermon Audio Giving tab, or the link, the PayPal link below in the YouTube notes. All right, so I've undertaken the extremely in-depth study of this prophecy of Daniel chapter 11, which involves the historical details of the Grecian Empire during the time period that extended from Alexander the Great to the takeover of the Roman Empire, so essentially the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire. And of course, the end of this prophecy is going to extend into the future, even beyond the year 2023, into the time of the Great Tribulation, which we'll get into. But specifically, the historical aspects of this prophecy also cover the time period from the book of Nehemiah, Malachi, right around that time, the end of the Old Testament to the start of the New Testament, the book of Matthew. All right, and so this prophecy in Daniel chapter 11 covers the 400-year or roughly 400-year intertestamental time period, the time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it also extends to the events that will occur during the Great Tribulation. All right, and so as I hinted at last week, the conflict in Daniel chapter 11 between the king of the north and the king of the south is going to be extremely pertinent to the end times, the beginning of sorrows and the Great Tribulation period, as I will reveal later on in these lessons. And if you haven't read Daniel 11 in a while, I recommend and encourage you to read it this week and kind of get yourself familiar with the material that we'll be going over and all the pronouns that are in this chapter and how it goes back and forth. And it gets actually very confusing to read, but what's interesting is if you take your time, if you study, if you look at the history of this thing, basically literally every single detail is pinpoint accurate, and we'll be getting into that. All right, so last week I went through the introduction and also verses 1 and 2 of Daniel chapter 11, which dealt with the Persian Empire and the 4 consecutive kings that followed Cyrus the Great. All right, so in Daniel chapter 11, verse 1, let's go ahead and look at it. It says, I also, this is the angel of the Lord speaking, and then he's basically referring back to the first year of Cyrus and the first year of Darius, which was the same time. All right, and so when Daniel chapter 11 verse 1 is being given, this is not dating the chapter to the first year of Darius the Mede. This is the angel continuing his speech from chapter 10, and he's reflecting back. He's saying, remember back in the first year of Darius the king, even I, stood to confirm and strengthen him. The angel of the Lord had stood to confirm and strengthen Darius. And right now, this is 3 years later, if you look at chapter 10, verse 1. All right, so we already went over that. So he says, also I, the angel of the Lord, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and that was Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius I Hystaspes. All right, and then he says the 4th, which was Xerxes, shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. All right, so Darius I, or Darius the Great, began the war with Greece, and bear in mind that the Persian Empire is over here. The capital is Susa, or Shushan, as the Bible would say. And Darius I Hystaspes had basically conquered all of this area, essentially all of the known world for the most part at that time. It had conquered everything and was starting to encroach into Greece. And Darius I had come into there but was defeated at the Battle of Marathon and had to go back. And then 10 years later, Xerxes takes the throne, and he comes with the second war against Greece. But And as I pointed out, he had that war at Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans, and eventually he had to also turn back and head back, okay? And so after these attacks from the Persian Empire, the Grecians hated the Persians. They hated the idea of being subjugated, period. They were very independent people, and they wanted liberty for themselves, and they hated the idea of being under Persian domination. All right, so because of these wars, the Greek people, they can't get along with hardly anything. You can even talk to some of the Greek missionaries to this day. There's Brother Demakos, a native-born Spartan. You know, he's over there in Greece, and he'll tell you to this day the Greek people cannot agree on anything. But finally, because of this threat from the Persian Empire, they're actually able to start agreeing, at least in their hatred of the Persians, and began formulating plans to strike back against the empire. All right, and then we have here in verse 3, it says, "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will." All right, I'm giving you these little pictures here so you can, and I'm going to be doing this throughout the chapter, because as we start going back and forth in the pronouns, the him and the he's and all this stuff, it's going to get really confusing, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the breakdown of each verse. And so what we have here is a mighty king, that's Alexander III of Macedon, or Alexander the Great, shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion. His dominion was from Greece all the way to India, and shall do according to his will. Now, I'm also going to try to keep these lessons a little bit shorter, so I'm going to be speaking fast, but I'm going to try not to go as long as I did last time and keep it around the 30-minute mark. All right, so the Grecian Empire, it says that he was going to have a great dominion, and the empire of Alexander is going to expand from Greece all the way to everything that Persia had, all the way to India and Afghanistan, or Bactria as it was called back in those days. So I don't have all of that on this map, but if you were to take this map and then duplicate it again, that'd be about the extent of Alexander's empire. It was a massive empire. And so verse 2 happened in 480 BC. All right, the rich king that we have here is King Xerxes in the verse, and him stirring up all against the realm of Greece was 480 BC. All right, and then verse 3 happens 143 years later. 143 years later, and that happens in 336 BC, and this is Alexander the Great. And he becomes king of Greece in 336 BC. So we have a 143-year gap in between verse 2 and verse 3. And the Bible will often do this, where it will leap over large swaths of time without any warning. And in many prophecies of the Bible, a comma or a period or a semicolon can represent a vast amount of time. Sometimes as much as 2,000 years can be contained in just one little comma. So bear in mind, even though verse 2 and 3, just read together, there's a big time gap in between there. And God is not doing anything wrong by doing that, by having a time gap, nor is God being misleading in his prophecy. This is just simply how he's chosen to write the scriptures, and we just simply need to be aware of that when we're studying the Bible, and we just need to believe the Word of God, study the Word of God, and that'll help us to avoid being tripped up by these things. All right, the other thing that you should keep in mind is that in between verses 2 and verse 3, as I pointed out last week, you can cram in the book of Esther, at least chapters 2 through 10. You can also input the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah, the book of Haggai, the book of Zechariah, and the book of Malachi. So all those books in your Bible that you read, and I hope you read those Old Testament books, even the minor prophets, I hope you're spending time in those books, as all of these books can be crammed in between Daniel chapter 11, verse 2 and verse 3. That's where they fit on the timeline in that 143-year period. All right? So it says, mighty king Alexander III of Macedon shall stand up. He stands up in 336 BC. All right? So now let's talk about a little bit of geography here. All right? Macedonia was a region of what we would call northern Greece today. Greece today is essentially all of this right here. back in those days, this whole area wasn't quite unified. There was a lot of different city-states where each city was basically its own empire, so to speak, or each region. And so there's this whole area is very mountainous, and so the people are separated, and so they kind of formed their own governments, their own city-states, and it was very diverse and scattered in here. And so Macedonia was this northern portion of the area, and at that time, well, let me point this out. Macedonia, if you remember from the New Testament, was the area that Paul went to. And remember, he had seen the vision of the Macedonians saying, "Come unto us," and then Paul heads up in this direction, then they end up getting arrested, and they're in the jail, and then you remember they sing at midnight, and the jail shakes, and the jailer jumps in thinking that everybody's gone, he's about to kill himself, and then he has that conversation, the classic conversation with Paul and Silas, where he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And Paul says, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved." All of that is going on right in this area of Macedonia. All right, that's the area that we're talking about right now. Philippi, the book of Philippians, named after King Philip II. That city is right up there in Macedonia. Okay, so that's the area that we're talking about here. And back during Persian rule, Greece was divided into multiple different political regions, and all of those various regions were always fighting with each other. They could never get along. They were declaring their independence from one another. And it wasn't until King Philip II of Macedon that Greece was formed into a unified nation. All right, Philip II is the father of Alexander the Great. Okay, so it wasn't until this, right around this time period that we're talking, that Greece wasn't even really an empire, so to speak. It was just a bunch of scattered cities. Philip II, through his wars against Athens in the south, he defeated Athens, and there was some subsequent peace treaties, and those peace treaties was called the League of Corinth. All right, Corinth right around here, and so they come together with a league, and that established a federation of the Greek states. Okay, and that was 336. No, is that right? No, 338 BC. All right, 338 BC is the League of Corinth. We say, well, why is that important? Well, because this was the first time in history that this Grecian area and all these different regions of Greece formed together under a single head. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. For all practical purposes, at this time in 338 BC, this became the USG, the United States of Greece, the United City-States of Greece. Okay, it became a unified nation under a single president, if you will. Okay. And the president was basically Philip II of the United States of Greece, and he had fought a civil war in order to federalize the entire country. And Pella at that time was essentially the Washington, D.C., the capital of Greece at that time. Now here's the Wikipedia note on the League of Corinth. It says the title, the League of Corinth, was invented by modern historians because the first council of the League took place in Corinth, and the Greek word synedrion is better translated as Congress or conference rather than league. So in other words, the reason why I point that out, this league that Philip II created in Greece in 338 BC could be called the Congress of Corinth. The first Congress of Corinth. It's kind of interesting. All right. It says this in the Wikipedia article: the organization, the Congress of Corinth, was the first time in history that the Greek city-states would unify under a single political entity, being King Philip of Macedonia. All right. So that's kind of interesting what's going on in Greece at that time. It's very similar to the United States of America in some respects. You know, Philip II was kind of like the Abraham Lincoln of Greece in those days. All right, now Philip II, he had multiple wives and multiple boyfriends, for that matter. But in 356 BC, his wife Olympias gave birth to a little boy that they named Alexander. All right, 356 BC, Alexander the Third is born. All right, and he's the third because prior to King Philip, there had been two other Alexanders, and so he's named after the family. So he's Alexander the Third of Macedon, and he's born into royalty. All right, so he's next in line for the throne. Now, an interesting side note about Alexander's birth is that Olympias, she had always maintained that her ancestry could be traced back to the temple of Zeus, and that her family could be traced back to Achilles, the Hercules of the Trojan War, the weird giant of the Trojan War. So there's kind of an interesting connection there. But then also Plutarch, the historian, he records that the night before Philip and Olympias got married, Olympias had a dream or had a vision of some sort that a bolt of lightning struck her in the belly, and there was light or flames flashing all around the room, and then they were suddenly dissipated. And so there's this idea that whatever was coming, whoever the baby or child of Olympias was going to be somebody special. All right? And then sometime later, after they were married, Philip was up late one night, evidently, and he looked through the hole of the bedroom door, and he saw his wife Olympias sleeping on the bed with a serpent lying next to her on the bed. That's interesting. I don't know if this was like a snake serpent or like a reptilian serpent. I don't really know what exactly he saw in there. But evidently this was a big turnoff for Philip, and he didn't really spend much time with Olympias after that because he thought that because of this she was some kind of sorceress, or perhaps she had fornicated with some sort of spiritual entity like an incubus or something like that. All right, so whatever he saw, it was enough to change his actions and activity and affection for Olympias. So, these were the rumors that were circulating around in regards to Alexander the Third, and it was commonly believed by the Greek people that he was a titan, or he was half man, half god, or just a god born in the flesh, because of all these rumors circulating around. Was Alexander the son of the reptilian? Maybe I should do one of those titles on the YouTube video so it'll get a lot of hits, one of those shock titles, Alexander the Great was a son of a reptilian, something like that. I don't know if I'll do that or not. Maybe I will. Maybe it'd be fun to do. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, how much of this really happened and how much of it was made up, there's no way to know. But the thing that you should remember is that Greece was a very, very pagan, idolatrous nation. And wherever idolatry is rampant, paranormal, demonic activity is always rampant also. I'll say that again. Wherever there is idolatry rampant, paranormal activity is rampant also. So who knows what kind of demonic interaction and demonic activity was going on in that kingdom at that time. All right, by the way, similar things are reported to this day in various cultures of the world, except the modern terminology today is UFOs and aliens, whereas back in those days it was chariots in the sky and gods. So nothing's really changed. All right. Alexander is born in 356 BC. The Greek states become united in 338 BC. I wish I hadn't written that one below because that's confusing. All right, so Alexander, I'm going to put 356 BC, is born. 18 years later, Philip, his father, Philip II, unifies Greece under the Congress of Corinth. All right. And now that all the Greek states had joined forces, Philip II is now preparing for an attack against the Persian Empire, whose kingdom was right on the doorstep of Greece. All right, so he's getting ready to attack Persia. But before he could execute his plans, Philip II was assassinated by a bodyguard of his named Pausanias. All right, now Pausanias was a scorned boyfriend of Philip II. All right, or Philip III. I keep saying Philip II. It's Philip the Third. No, it is Philip II. I wrote Philip III here. My bad. All right. Pausanias was a scorned boyfriend of Philip II. Okay, the king, Alexander's father. And there's a pretty sordid story behind all of that I will forbear to mention here. But at the wedding ceremony of one of Philip's daughters, Pausanias assassinated King Philip II, and as Pausanias was running away, he tripped over a vine, and then the king's bodyguards caught up to him and stabbed him with their spears on the ground. And one of the notable men that stabbed and killed Pausanias, the assassin of the king, was a man named Perdiccas. All right, and he's going to be important to our story next week. All right, since King Philip II was now dead, Alexander III, who is now 20 years old at this time, is instantly put onto the throne 336 BC. That's when Philip was assassinated and when Alex becomes king. All right, and he's made king of the United States of Greece. All right, and so it says in verse 3 of Daniel 11, and a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. All right, so Alexander III began immediately to continue his father's war plans against Persia, and in 334 BC, all right, so now we're at 334, he mounts his attack, he begins his attack against the Persian Empire, all right? And since Alex was going to be gone for a while, obviously, he's going to start traveling in this direction and attacking Persia and start taking territory. Since Alexander was going to be gone, he had to leave somebody in charge of the Grecian Empire while he was gone to take care of things back home at Washington, D.C. All right, so he left a friend of the family named Antipater back there who was basically regent of the empire while Alexander was gone. And again, Antipater will be important to our story next week. All right, so off Alexander goes, gaining victory after victory after victory after victory. And Alexander defeated the last and final king of Persia, Darius III, in 331 BC. That's a terrible 3. All right. 331 BC is when Darius III, the king of Persia, is conquered down here, and essentially at that time, because the king of Persia has been taken, Alexander is now the de facto king of the empire. All right? So the massive, mighty Persian Empire that had defeated Babylon and had ruled this entire region for 200 years and had taken 200 years to just gain all this area, all right? Alexander conquered the entire thing and more in 3 years. Alexander was the GOAT, the greatest of all time up until that point. I mean, literally. I mean, you think about the achievements and the accomplishments of a single man and what that single man did, regardless of whether he was a good man or a bad man, moral man or an immoral man. All that's beside the point. What I'm saying is, for a human being to do what he did is incredible. And it would be completely unbelievable if it didn't actually happen. But he took this entire area in 3 years, which is amazing. Look at Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8, and this is going to be another vision that Daniel had way in advance of this goat. He sees this angry flying goat. All right, Daniel chapter 8, verse 5. It says, "And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground." Daniel 8, verse 5. So that is implying that this goat is flying. It's a flying goat. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. All right, horns in these prophecies represent kings. This notable horn is Alexander III of Macedon. Verse 6, "And he came to the ram, the Persian Empire, that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power." All right, here comes the goat, the screaming, flying goat. And he says, "And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler," or anger and rage, moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram, no power in the Persian Empire to stand before him, Alexander, and he, the goat, cast him, the ram, down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great." All right, so Alexander's empire covered all of the Persian territory and beyond, as far into as far as Afghanistan and India. And so Alexander's empire was larger than the Persian Empire. And again, he did all of that in 3 years, which is amazing. All right, and then it says, "And when he was strong, the great horn, Alexander the Great, was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven." All right, that's Daniel 8, verse 8. All right, so this same prophecy that God gives Daniel in chapter 8, some of those details are repeated in chapter 11. All right, so that brings us to Daniel chapter 11, verse 4. All right, let's see, let's get rid of that. All right, verse 4. "And when he, Alexander the Third, shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those." All right, so Alexander dies in Babylon in 323 BC. I apologize for how sloppy all of this is right here. But in 323 BC, Alexander dies. He wasn't killed in battle. He had essentially conquered all of his enemies, at that point. But what happened was he was having parties in Babylon after he had killed Darius III, conquered the Persian Empire. Now he's over in Babylon, and he's having these drunken parties. And shortly after days and days on end of these parties, Alexander ends up getting sick, and he dies. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why he died and what happened. Some say that he was maybe poisoned by an enemy. Others say that he caught some kind of disease from one of the battles that he was fighting, and his symptoms are reminiscent of malaria or typhoid or something like that. The other possibility is that he may have poisoned himself with all of the alcohol that he was drinking, which is a very good possibility. But, as we all know, he undoubtedly died of COVID-19, because that's what everybody dies from, right? Oh, wait, nobody believes that lie anymore. Okay, but anyway, an interesting side note about Alexander's death, he was perfectly fine until after all these parties, he came down with a major fever, and slowly he became more and more lethargic until it got to the point that he couldn't even move, and he could only communicate by moving his eyes, up, down, left, right, blink, or something like that. He couldn't move. He was completely paralyzed, and finally he stopped moving altogether. His eyes were shut, and the Greeks declared him as dead. They called for the Egyptians to do a professional embalming, and while they were waiting for the Egyptians to arrive, what they did is they plopped Alexander's corpse, or his body, on the throne. All right, so it was sitting there. And when the Egyptians arrived 7 days later to embalm Alexander, the Egyptians were very disturbed and they were very nervous because Alexander's body didn't show any signs of decomposition even after 7 days of being dead. All right? And so the Egyptians, they're pretty familiar with dead bodies and the embalming process, and they're telling the Greeks, this guy's not dead. And the Greeks, they assured him that he was dead, And the reason why he hadn't started decomposing, they explained to the Egyptians, was because he was a god. You see, he was a god, and so that's why his body is not decomposing, so embalm him, all right? And so the Egyptians, they're like, okay, okay. And so they begin the embalming process, which included, the whole scraping out of his brains and the internal organs and all of that gross stuff. But what's incredible, though, is from our modern understanding of medicine, is that Alexander was likely not dead when they began the embalming process, but was probably just in a coma, or even more disturbing, may have just been paralyzed and unable to move or to communicate, and possibly still had all of his mental faculties intact. So he was possibly embalmed alive. I mean, honestly, more than likely, by all indications, he was, because Alexander was not a god, absolutely, and a body begins the decomposition process, and after 7 days it stinks and it's gross, all right? But since he hadn't begun that, it implies that his heart's still beating and he's still alive. And they embalmed him anyway. So they essentially killed Alexander at that time, all right? So the verse in Daniel, it says it's the kingdom, after Alexander dies, it's not going to go to his posterity, all right? So Alexander, he fornicated with a lot of women over this time period, like a conquering king would, but he only had 3 official wives. He had Roxana, who is the princess of Bactria, which is northern Afghanistan, all right? So Roxana. He had Stateria and also Perisatis, all right? So those are his 3 main wives. And no one expected Alexander to die so young or so suddenly, so when he died, everything about the successorship of his kingdom was in turmoil. Now, when a king dies, normally a son would take over, or if there's no son, a brother of the king or the next of kin would become king of the empire. The issue in Alexander's case was that he had a child, but it was still in Roxana's womb, all right? And the child hadn't been born yet when Alexander died, and no one knew if the child was going to be a boy or if it was going to be a girl. Because here's the thing, if Roxana's child in her womb is a boy, then that child would become king. But if it was a girl, then it wouldn't, obviously, she wouldn't rule. And then Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus would have to become king in that case. But the problem with Philip III Aridaeus becoming king was that he was a mental handicap and was not fit to rule. So what a mess. The problem that the Grecian Empire faced was, at this time, Alexander's dead, and so all the military generals are standing in a circle looking at each other like, what do we do? Do we wait for the baby to be born, and if it's male, do we make the baby king? Or do we give the throne to Alexander's handicapped half-brother, Philip III? Well, some argued for one thing and some argued for the other until everyone finally decided, okay, here's what we'll do. Philip III Aridaeus, he'll be king until the baby is born. And as soon as the baby is born, then we'll determine its gender and determine if that baby is going to be king also. And fun fact, all of those people at that time believed that they could determine a child's gender at birth. Believe it or not, nobody was stupid enough to believe that gender was a social construct that was to be determined independently by the person later on in their life. They believed that they could determine the child's gender the second it was born. Those savages, right? Well, baby Alexander IV was born. It was a boy. They called it, his name was Alexander IV. And so it was decided that at least for the time being, baby Alex IV and Philip III, the autistic Philip III, we'll just put it that way, they would be co-rulers, all right? Now, if you can imagine a snapshot of the royal rulers of Greece at that time, you would have a mentally handicapped Philip III slouched next to baby King Alexander IV. Smile. What a mess. They're both singing baby shark, do 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 do, baby shark. They're both just about on the same level mentally, okay? Now, what we have here is, let's get rid of that. It says in Daniel 11:4, it says, when he, Alexander III of Macedon, shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven. All right. Now, when we read the four winds of heaven, what we tend to think of is we tend to think of four clean-cut cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Okay. But truthfully, when you see that phrase, the four winds of heaven, throughout the Bible, if you take your Bible and study that phrase, it is a figure of speech that just refers to all directions. Okay, every direction. So the figure of speech in Matthew 24, verse 31. I'm going a little bit over my 30 minutes, so I'm trying to hurry here. Matthew 24, verse 31, look at what Jesus says using this phrase. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. All right, so in the millennium, at the second advent, when Jesus sends his angels to gather the people from the four winds, it's not like some go north, some go south, some go east, some go west, and they gather people from those four directions, but the people that are northeast or southwest, they don't get gathered. No, you have to understand that the four winds of heaven it just simply means it's a figure of speech referring to every direction, okay? Mark 13:27 is another clarification. It says, he shall send his angels and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, i.e., from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven, okay? Now, I say that, I make this distinction because as I showed you there in Daniel 11:4, it says, his kingdom shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, meaning in all directions, not necessarily north, south, east, and west, because if you think of it that way, it's going to become a little bit confusing. And also, in 323 BC, when Alexander died, the empire was not initially divided up into four clean-cut north, south, east, west regions. As a matter of fact, it was divided up into no less than 24 different regions, 12 to the east, 12 to the west, and 24 different people ruling over those areas, okay? Eventually, after about 3 decades of infighting, the kingdom would be partitioned into 4 main regions among 4 main rulers, just like Daniel 8:8 said, okay? Daniel 8:8 says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven, okay? 4 notable ones. But initially, it was 24, okay? It wasn't until about 30 years later that you get down to the final 4, okay? The final 4 in Greece. There were 4 notable ones who eventually ruled over 4 predominant regions, but their kingdoms weren't clean-cut, equal north, south, east, and west cardinal directions. All right. So the reason why I point this out is because this has often confused me when looking at maps of the Grecian Empire after Alexander's death. Because you have the southern region, which is pretty easy to identify, the southern portion of Alexander's empire, and then you have the eastern portion of Alexander's empire, and I'm just kind of putting these dots in their general areas. You have the eastern portion of the empire that was broken up to the Seleucids. You have the Ptolemies in the south. And then up here you had a portion of Thrace, this area of the kingdom. But then you also had the Macedonian area over here. All right? So these are not equal sizes that these things were eventually partitioned into. And the other thing is that this area of Asia Minor, this area is constantly being fought over by these kings. And so this area right here, the middle of the kingdom, is constantly shifting hands. And so if you're thinking about this in terms of, well, this is north, this is south, this is east, this is west, it's going to get a little bit confusing because these two areas, this is only barely north of this. And the other problem is when you're reading about the king of the north versus the king of the south, if you're thinking in terms of cardinal directions of the Grecian Empire, well, technically the king of the north is up here because Thrace is the northernmost portion of the empire. But the king of the north in Daniel chapter 11 is the Seleucid king, and the king of the south is the Ptolemaic kings, and they're the ones that are fighting against each other, and that's fine for the most part. Number one, a northern part of the Grecian Empire is the Seleucids. Technically the Thrace is a little bit farther north technically, but this is still mostly north, and also the Seleucid Empire is north of Israel. Okay, so that's important. So you'd think, well, shouldn't it say the king of the east versus the king of the south? Because the Seleucids controlled this area to the east of the Grecian Empire? No. So again, it's a little bit tedious to point out those details, but I just wanted to point that out because, like I said, when you look at the maps of the Grecian Empire after Alexander's death, and if you're looking for a clear-cut north, south, east, and west, it's going to be hard to find, and it's going to be a little bit confusing. So the 4 winds of heaven that it's divided into is not necessarily north, south, east, and west. It's all directions. And then as we get focused on this area, as we go into the chapter, the king of the north is the Seleucids, the king of the south is the Ptolemies in Egypt. All right? So, yes, the kingdom was divided into 4 divisions, exactly as the Bible prophesied, but this 4-part division was not instantaneous. There was a lot of fighting that ensued because what happened is the various generals had a lot of ambition to take over the kingdom for themselves. Okay? And it took about 25 years for the dust to settle into the 4 primary divisions of the Greek Empire. All right, now what we could do is I could skip to the 4-way division of the empire. We could fast forward 30 years, but I feel like if I'm going to take the time to do this massive in-depth study of Daniel chapter 11, I want to do it right and I want to be somewhat thorough. Because a lot of what follows in Daniel chapter 11 is going to stem from the 25 years of war that occurred after Alexander's death. So I think what would be best is next week I'm going to set the scene of what happened right after Alexander's death and how these empires got split up and who got what and all the fighting that started taking place, because that is going to set the background for verse 5. Verse 5 of Daniel 11 is not going to make a whole lot of sense unless you kind of get the picture of what happened the 25 years in between verse 4 and verse 5. So that's what we'll do next week. We got through verses 3 through 4 today, but we'll start making more progress in the coming weeks. Like I said, I simply want to set the scene and get everything all assembled, set up the props, get all the actors in place, so that way when we start plowing through the next 30 verses, they will finally make sense to you because I gave you the full context. So anyway, God bless you. Have a good week.